disparity, the social injustice show. Today's topics are gender inequality and sex trafficking.
Our first topic for today is gender inequality in the workplace. Men and women are in the same playing field when it pertains to educational achievement. In fact, women have surpassed men in the United States. The problem sprouts from growing a family. Women are put at a disadvantage when they decide to take on childbearing responsibilities and have a home life. There are more women than men graduating from college and graduate school, with equal numbers going into medicine and law. In fact, because of this, or with this, there are only 4% of women being Fortune 500 CEOs and 19% of them going into Congress. Female-dominated professions such as restaurant service and childcare occupy the lower rungs of the wage ladder. Women make up only 63% of federal workers, with a minimum wage of $7.25. Women make up only 27% of the top 10% of top earners, with their share of higher income groups running smaller. Women earn less than 81 cents to every male dollar. The largest pay gaps in managerial positions, where men make $80,000 a year on average compared to just $50,000 a year for women, is the situation right now. Some of the ways that we can overcome gender inequality then in the workplace would be through methods of more job flexibility and job sharing options, and also having men go on family leave, noting sexist language and solid childcare choices. The awareness of societal assumptions can make a difference going forward, from increasing conversations about these topics to starting from the family level and questioning sexist language. There's an opportunity to close the gender gap with future generations. Public policy is also being put forward to increase gender inequality in the workplace and at home.
Thank you, Q. Now we'll go to a brief clip of Dr. Valerie McCauley at the National Association of Gender Studies conference last week.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Valerie McCauley, and today we are talking about gender inequality and sex trafficking. Gender inequality has been a social issue for centuries. During the Bronze Age, the female deceased were buried with less riches than men. Men had richer diets with domesticated animals and new crops, whereas women ate what would later be called the poor man's diet, which resulted in them being anemic and made them rely a lot on wheat. In the mid-1800s, to protest prostitution, the British Parliament passed the Contagious Disease Act that would allow women suspected of prostitution or discovered to have a venereal disease to be put in prison. But men were still allowed to seek prostitution and pay for them, thus creating a double standard we still see today. That a man is expected to have had multiple partners by the time he is married, but a woman is supposed to be a virgin until her wedding night. In 1866, the 14th Amendment, which defines citizens and voters as male. In 1873, the Supreme Court rules that a state can forbid a married woman from practicing law. In 1890, Wyoming granted women the right to vote. In 1920, women are granted the right to vote in the United States. Sure, it wasn't all bad. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull became the first female presidential candidate. In 1887, Susanna Salter became the first woman to be a mayor of a U.S. town, in Aronia, Kansas. But it took 54 years for a woman to be granted the right to vote, 54 years of protests and demands, but gender inequality doesn't stop there. In 1932, during World War II, Japan had a system where women across Asia were forced into sexual slavery. The women were kept in what was called comfort stations. The women were detained in a small cubicle and received beatings and other tortures if they were defiant. Because of this, many women ultimately died of disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, suicide, etc. The stations were surrounded by barbed wire, making escape impossible. The Japanese government set up these stations in hopes of preventing rape crimes in public, prevent the spread of STDs, and to provide comfort for soldiers so they wouldn't tell military secrets. In 1956, India initiated the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, which prosecutes the third parties involved in trafficking. These activities involved running brothels, living on the earnings of sex work, capturing and imprisoning people under prostitution, etc. It can be argued, however, that this act failed to protect the women who may have been forced into prostitution. Many of the arrests that were made were for the sex workers due to soliciting, and they may have ultimately lost everything. Those are just two examples of human sex trafficking in other countries, but it happens here in the United States too. It happens anywhere, and it can be in every neighborhood and on every street. Most people will see prostitutes and think they chose that life, when most don't. A lot of women will be trafficked and held with threats against their family or friends. Traffickers are commonly known as pimps. In an interview with Kimberly Melham or Orzuko, Carlos Curtis says that pimps will often fill a hole for a woman who had never had a father figure. Often pimps charade themselves by telling the women they will care for them and love them, while providing for them so long as they meet a quota.
Wow. Okay, so does anyone have any comments on Dr. McCauley's clip?
I just can't believe that it took women 54 years of protests and demands to get their right to vote while men had it this entire time. It's just so crazy. Q, would you like to lead us into the personal stories of women who have been through the horrendous tragedy that is sex trafficking?
Yes, I have two stories here of sex trafficking victims, Anne and Rebecca. First, we start out with Anne. Anne's story starts in Nigeria, where her mother was a farmer, but with so many children and no male support, she sent her to foster parents to be educated. After her foster father died, her uncle Joseph said he would take her abroad with a friend Moses to be educated. Moses then took Anne to the airport. He kept all the documentation and told her to stay, that she was his daughter. They flew to London, where Moses put Anne in the back of a car with two strangers who attempted to have sex with her, and when she refused, Moses branded her and threatened her by saying he had not brought her here for free and that she had to do what I say or bad things will happen to you. The next day, Anne was raped by a man who had been paid to initiate Anne into sex slavery. She was then locked into the flat and could not escape. For the next 3 months, about every 2 days, she was taken from the flat and forced to have sex with other men. Luckily, with her customers, Colin, who asked her about her age, she was able to, flee that life. The second is Rebecca's story, who was opted into the Sumangali scheme. Sumangali means happily married woman. It's a child labor scheme that is practiced in the textile industry to lure young girls that are about 14 to 18 years old to work in the textile mill. Rebecca is a young girl from India from a poor background, and when Rebecca's family couldn't afford food agents, the mill came and offered her food, accommodation, and a salary for 8 hours work a day. They were told that Rebecca would be given her paid for a dowry, which she could get married at the end. Rebecca's parents agreed to the scheme, and she went with the agents to the mill. However, once she arrived at the mill, what she had been promised couldn't have been further from the truth. She realized that there was no safety at all at the mills, despite her having to operate heavy machinery. On top of this, she quickly became very ill from the stomach pains caused by cotton fibers filling her stomach. Despite this, she was not permitted to take days off or given medical attention. She worked 12-hour days with no breaks and very little pay compared to what was promised, with hardly any of the girls receiving their dowry at the end. She was sexually abused by her bosses, who took a girl whenever they felt like it. Her sleeping conditions were also very cramped, with all of the girls packed into small rooms on the floor. Despite the conditions, she could not leave as she had nowhere to go, with no skills and no dowry to pay for her husband.
Thank you, Q, for enlightening us on what it is really like to be in the sex trafficking industry and the labor trafficking industry. Now, Kaya and I will explain to you the statistics of the people in sex trafficking and the targets and places. So the sex trafficking industry is $1 million business, one that has been around for centuries, even before it was named sex trafficking. This industry has been steadily growing in the past couple of years. 600,000 to 800,000 people were trafficked worldwide just last year. Out of that number, 14,500 people to 17,500 people were trafficked in the US alone. But let's get a little closer to home. Thanks to the I-95 corridor connecting Baltimore with Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Miami, Maryland has become a hub for sex trafficking. Maryland has ranked number 4 among the top states per capita in trafficking in 2016, and according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, there were 898 trafficking cases in Maryland last year. While you may be at risk for abduction anywhere you go, CNN's recent study on sex trafficking in the areas with higher susceptibility to sex trafficking show that the primary locations for trafficking include rest stops, truck stops, bars, bus stops, impoverished areas are the primary locations. Most abductions occur when the victim is alone in these types of places. In fact, 70% of human trafficking incidents occur at truck stops across the U.S.
That's good to know, but did you also know that not only are sex trafficking victims women, but they're also men as well? The victims can be divided into two groups. There are the children that are 18 and under, and then there's others who are 18 and above who've been forced into commercial sex through fraud, force, and coercion. While victims of sex trafficking have very diverse backgrounds and ages, of course, their vulnerabilities that increase their susceptibility to be trafficked include individuals who are young runaways, youth, and people who are, as you said, live in impoverished backgrounds. Many victims will go missing with something within their home, or they needed a way to survive on their own. Some victims have repeated behavior patterns that include being under the influence, the lack of a proper adult in their lives, and they often wind up in areas that they're unfamiliar with, which makes them seek shelter and help among others. Their traffickers will prey on this fact and manipulate them into being sex trafficked. They'll pose as boyfriends or significant others. Many people in their sex traffickers it isn't just strangers. It's also family members that range from even women. It may start off with them having to go on dates with other men, nothing sexual at first, but then it leads to them becoming more intimate with the men, and eventually they're forced. This issue is so important because most people do not willingly choose this lifestyle, and that's what some fail to realize. It's never a choice. Most of it comes from the fact that they lack self-confidence, self-esteem, and innocence within their life. If you or someone else that you know is a sex trafficking victim, please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888, or you can visit humantraffickinghotline.org.
Thank you, Kaya, for that. Now we'll go to Q with the sex trafficking target.
The marginalization of women have left them in traps of poverty. They're unequipped with skills needed to escape, giving them the position of a dependent, which means that they're unable to provide for themselves. This puts women at the mercy of their closest male relation, which could include a father, uncle, or an older brother. The cyclical oppression that reinforces gender inequality gives credence to patriarchal attitudes confirmed by other women who were taught this. This instills an attitude of inferiority from birth. The development of sectors with women-specific demand have been caused by gender perceptions of female skills, values, and sexuality. There's a demand for women in prostitution roles. Discriminatory socio-cultural practices make women vulnerable to trafficking. Impoverished political practices such as poor leadership make trafficking low risk and high profit, which increases the number of people doing it. The everyday sexism strengthens the idea that women are commodities. This idea is distributed through media, where patriarchal views are injected into public consciousness unsuspectingly.
Now we go to Julia, our field expert. She is speaking with a lawyer specialist about the laws around human trafficking and sex trafficking.
Good afternoon. Today we'll have Dr. Isabella Ramos with us to explain a little bit more about human trafficking laws.
Good afternoon. So the first federal law addressing human trafficking was the TVPA in 2000.
What does the TVPA consist of?
The TVPA consists of 3 simple approaches: to protect, to prosecute, and to prevent.
When was it reauthorized?
The TVPA was reauthorized through the TVPR in 2003, 2005, 2008, and 2013.
What does the TVPA include?
U.S. federal law trafficking includes both sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
Would you be able to explain a little bit more about those 3 approaches of the law?
Of course. So we have prosecution, which involves passing appropriate laws that criminalize trafficking and jailing the abusers who exploit other humans for profit. Then we have protection, which involves identifying victims, providing them with medical care and shelter, and if necessary, witness protection, and when appropriate, repatriating them. Then we have prevention, which involves raising awareness of the inhumane practices involved in the trafficking trade and promoting a paradigm shift that seeks to reduce the demand for the fruits of human trafficking.
Thank you so much for your participation.
Of course.
Well, you heard from Q about gender inequality in the workplace along with the victim stories, as well as Dr. McCauley's speech from the NAGS conference, and the statistics on target people and places susceptible to sex trafficking.
Thanks for watching Prosperity. Thank you for tuning in to Prosperity. Here are some things you can do to help the situation. You can create conversations, bring this up, whether it's with your government, your local government, or just with the people around you. Just get people informed and further educate yourself. You can never stop learning about this issue. You can host charity runs to raise funds for your local shelters. You'd be interested to find that there are many, many shelters that help abused, trafficked women and children, along with men in your community. You can also support survivors through survivor-made products, like To The Market, which is a homemade goods and fashion store, Nightlight, a jewelry store, and Thistle Farms, a body and hair products place. Again, if you or someone you know has been sex trafficked or is being sex trafficked, please contact the hotline, which will be listed after this. Thank you. Have a good week.
Because I can't edit it like that.
It's also not her part. Wait.
No, because it's going to be like in the middle. Kaya just suddenly disappeared and then came back.
Oh yeah.
So,